Uh, welcome. My name is Gerald vanHeerden, and I am artistic director, and creative person with VMHF Theatricals, and it's been my pleasure to work with the play Relatively Conscious by Jon-Marc McDonald. And so I've gathered some interesting voices here today to have a conversation after we've kind of gotten an understanding of Jon-Marc's play, Relatively Conscious. Our first panelist, Dana Steele, is producer and playwright. She is a Texas Rock Radio Hall of Famer, host of the Rockstar Principles podcast, and a best-selling author of numerous books on success. She is also a popular motivational keynote speaker, serial entrepreneur, Broadway and West End investor, Come From Away, Tina the Musical, Chasing Rainbows, The Early Judy Garland Story, and Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cinderella, and a former U.S. congressional candidate. Steele and her wonder husband, longtime NASA pilot and author Charles Utz, live in Houston, Palm Springs, and New York City. They have 3 grown sons, 1 bonus daughter, and the occasional rescue dog. Welcome, Dana.
Thank
C.B.
you.
Murray. C.B. Murray has a BA with a concentration in social justice from SUNY Empire State College. He's a director, composer, writer, producer, and performer. CB began with the Amos Repertory Company, was in the workshop and original production of Dreamgirls, performed twice on Broadway, numerous times off Broadway, on TV, and in films. CB's original musical, Pearl, received 5 Eldelco nominations while in development. He received awards from SMPS, Society of Marketing Professional Services, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer as a teaching artist, and the Union City, New Jersey Artist of the Year Award in 2015. In February 2020, he won the Players Theater Short Play Festival. His short, Lift Every Voice and Sing, is in the open presentation for the 2020 TNEC International Film Festival, and his screenplay, Ambassador of Love, is in the finals of the 2020 Harlem Film Festival for Best Screenplay. CB is an ordained pastor with the Apostolic Church of Jesus Christ. Welcome, CB. And our final panelist, Jon-Marc Valentini McDonald, playwright, is a Texas native. In 1998, while managing the congressional campaign of Brian Babin, Jon-Marc was outed as a gay man, which, along with the murder of in the same year of James Byrd Jr., was the impetus for his play, Relatively Conscious. The play premiered at the New York Theater Festival in February 2018, set against the backdrop of a diner in East Texas. Relatively Conscious fictitiously brings together 4 disparate characters the morning Byrd was murdered. He is the grandson of a prominent Southern Baptist minister, and in May of 2016 presented his paper, Relatively Conscious, The Enduring Rage of Baldwin and the Education of a White Southern Baptist Queer, at the Baldwin Conference in Paris. The paper was subsequently published in the James Baldwin Review. Jon-Marc has, among other things, served as the publicist for the estate of Rue McClanahan, the executive director of a dance company in New York City, and the communications officer for the Hong Kong Trade Development Council. In May of 2020, he graduated from Columbia University with a master's in writing. Jon-Marc currently resides in Manhattan with his husband, Juan, and their dog, Cam. Welcome. I would like to first put the question out there. Each of you come from and have navigated quite a different world. And I want you to speak about, or to start the conversation about your experiences with race, racism, and kind of and the distance that you have felt or not, or have you been in the thick of it in your grasp as you have navigated, and now that we have had the now that we've had the opportunity to kind of understand many of the ideas that are present in Relatively Conscious. So I'll throw it out. I'll put it to one of you to pick up on that conversation.
Well, you have three people here who aren't afraid to talk. So, you know, being the whitest of everyone sitting here in the four Brady Bunch squares here, I'm going to speak up. And I guess the best story I can tell is, it's a very long story, but I ended up with the entire cast and crew of The Lion King in my backyard twice, the first tour and then the last tour before they retooled it. And the very last person left, one of the hyenas was in the pool with me, and there was a lot of wine involved, and we were solving all the world's problems. And I was contemplating a run for Congress at that point in time, never having been a politician, but pretty pissed off at what was happening at that point. And I was telling him about the way I was raised. And I used the phrase, I was raised to not see differences in people. I was not raised in a racist household. And he was like, girl, you got to stop it right there. I need you to stop talking like that. I need you to see racism. I need you to stop and open your eyes. And it was really eye-opening for me that I thought just because I was raised by a mother that said, oh, we accept everyone, that everything was hunky-dory, as we say in Texas. And he opened my eyes that it wasn't. And from that point on, as I went to run for Congress in Southeast Texas, which is how I met Jon-Marc, I had Google Alerts set up for my campaign on my opponent. And when an article on my opponent came up about a gay playwright, I'm like, what? Where did we get there? And I was exposed to it. I knew there was a lot of racism in Southeast Texas because all of my relatives are from Southeast Texas. My grandfather was a deacon in the church, and then we would go to lunch at Luby's cafeteria, and he would use the N-word, and I would get in trouble for saying at 6, 7 years old, wait a minute, we just came from church, and Papa just said the N-word, and I would constantly be in trouble for calling that out. So maybe I was a politician much earlier than I really thought I was. But running for Congress, I guess, not only did the gentleman Charles from The Lion King open my eyes to what I wasn't seeing. Yes, I was taught to accept and love everyone, but I wasn't taught to see the disparities around me. And then to run for Congress and to see even more and more is what brought me to Jon-Marc. It brought me to this show. It brought back a lot of the feelings that I felt as a child when I would question the words I heard around me. So that's sort of the short version, but that's what brought me to Relatively Conscious. And one of the things I want to do is see this play come to life even more. We've staged it once in Houston, but I didn't know who James Baldwin was. I read Nancy Drew, white girl in the suburbs. I was in New York last week and went to see my middle son's new apartment. And I got to tell you how proud I was when I looked over on his nightstand and saw that one of his 2 books were the writings. I don't know the particular title, but it was the writings of James Baldwin. And I was like, okay, I've done something right. So that's kind of my story.
Gerald.
Sure. So I wanted to start off the conversation, and I want each of you to speak about your experience or not, how you navigated the world, and what is your way into the material that was a part of, and the ideas that are present in Relatively Conscious, and speak from the heart. But I want to understand what road you navigated with race and racism that maybe led to some kind of awakening or not of consciousness, or the understanding that perhaps maybe you were being taught to raise, you were taught to kind of maybe be coming at the world from a place of privilege. So that was the question.
You want me to
Okay.
chime in?
Yeah, go ahead,
I'll
Stevie.
chime in. Well, this is an interesting question. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, in the 50s. And if you know anything about Richmond, we just had this big thing about taking down Ulysses S. Grant's statue on Monument Avenue, where Monument Avenue was this beautiful neighborhood in Virginia that I had to go through all the time because I was a tennis player. And it was just lined with all these Confederate statues of these, what they considered their heroes. That was my introduction to life as a child. I lived in Richmond, and it was shoved down our throats that, at one time this was the capital of the Confederacy, and we still felt the same way. I ran away from home at 17, basically, to just get out. I wanted to get out of Richmond so fast I couldn't even stand it. A friend of mine told me about a musical that was happening. I auditioned. I ended up doing musicals after school, after tennis practice. After school is my job. I didn't want to do theater, but it was something different. And then a cousin invited me to New York for a summer, and I never went back home. I just stayed. But I don't even know where to start. My family sort of always suffered from the idea of just being subservient to the people that they worked for. My mom's family was pretty uneducated. I was the only person in that house that ever graduated from high school, much less college. My father's family was on a different spectrum. My father's family broke out of poverty by going into show business. And there was always this friction in the home because my mom's family thought that my father's family thought they were better than. So not only was I dealing with racism, but I was also dealing with colorism, and I was also dealing with classism within our family. I was down south where I'm from. The lighter you were, the more easy it was for you to navigate in the white world. So I was a light-skinned kid with all this curly hair, and I was a good tennis player. So I was invited to go into all of the country clubs to play with their kids because I was nationally ranked. Their kids wasn't, so they invited me to play to make their kids better. So I got to see two different worlds. I lived in a horrible slum, but I would go and play tennis in these wonderful, rich neighborhoods. And sometimes the kids would invite me to spend the night. And I was like, people live like this? Wow. It was such a huge difference. When I got to New York, I started working with Rosetta Lenoir Amos. I was only a teenager. She let me stay there. And the only jobs for me were all Black musicals, all Black plays. It was like unthought of for me to try to do anything that wasn't a Black show. And I didn't really start working with anybody that wasn't Black until I met Michael Bennett in 1980, which was interesting because he picked me out of a Black show to come do a workshop that he was doing about Black people. And I was like, okay, this is different. But it still didn't change. I don't even know where to start. It didn't change. When I moved to New York, I thought things would be different, that I was going away from racism to a place that was be completely tolerant and diverse and encompassing. And I found out that it was still in New York, but it was undercover. I remember we were auditioning for Radio City, to be I was dancing at the time as a kid, and I was getting dance jobs all the time, and so I just knew I could walk into Radio City and get that job. And the white kids was like, "Oh, here come those weebies," and I was like, "What's a weebie? Weebie going to get in this show?" And I was like, "This is New York. I don't believe they're saying that in New York." And so it's and now I'm in my 60s, and I'm trying to find out how to bridge the divide. I went back to school just so that I could figure out how to write things that would bridge the divide. I love Jon-Marc's play because it sort of bridges the divide where it forces the two different sides to hear each other, to see each other, and I love that. I got to see it at KQ, and so I get to see it again. I was like, that was great. It was a privilege to come in and talk about it again. But I am, right now, everything I do right now is sort of trying to bridge that divide. I'm here at Irondale today because of that, and the things that I do, because it's, a man in my 60s, having grown up a child of the 60s and 70s in the South, you would think that by now it would be over. We thought it would be over, and I don't hope this isn't changing the subject, but 45 was a blessing and a curse, because the blessing was when we would say, "Look, this is the way things are," people would say, "Oh, it's only in your mind." But 45 sort of opened the door for all the evil to just go to spew out, and now we can say, "See, it's not in our minds. It's there. It's real."
I like what my husband says. He says, nobody is totally worthless. They can always serve as a bad example. So that's what we said a lot. But you're right. Things I had tried to say, even during the campaign, it's starting to come out. I just saw something the other day that I've seen a couple of times, and it was just a note to candidates. To white candidates, don't go into black churches and say, "There's a problem, I'm with you." Go into your white churches and say, "There's a problem. We need to step up and be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem."
I ran away from show business for about 20 years because I thought there was no hope. And I got ordained and I went straight into the Christian world. I was opening conferences for people like, should I say names? I don't know.
Yes, by all means. Yes,
Well,
please
I was
share.
opening conferences for people like T.D. Jakes, and I was doing worship services for World Vision. I was on staff with Bill Bright. I did all these crazy things, and thinking that I could move into the Christian world where I wouldn't see the same racism or the same classism or the same greed, and it was worse. I mean, it was absolutely worse. I cannot begin to tell you. There's this book called Jesus and John Wayne. Read it, because it talks about how the evangelical movement was a part of the whole white supremacy movement and how they worked together. And I got so fed up with church and the way it was. And I was like, this is bad show business. If I'm going to do this, I might as well go back to what I was doing at first, because that's really what it was. It was just a bad version of show business trying to brainwash people into thinking that this was the way things were supposed to be. So now,
just like my grandfather, the way he would talk after we would leave church, it was just like, wait a minute, that's not what I learned in Sunday school today. Excuse me, my hand's up. Excuse me, this is not at all making any sense.
And scary thing for me is that as a black person, there are those there are black people who were able to navigate racism and make a living and make it work for them. So in making it work for them, especially in the Christian world, they never spoke out against it. Because as long as those tithes and offerings were coming in and they were making, and your offering was making them a 1%er, they weren't going to mess up the flow and shake up the apple cart. They were just like, just keep on believing and it'll be all, as long as you keep giving me your money. And
yeah, because it wasn't about Jesus. It was about money.
It's always
about
money.
That's it. That's it.
And so,
so John Michael, we're talking about your play.
Yes, we are, because he brings it up.
It's Gerald's show, but I interview people for a living for 40 years, so I'm just taking over the show.
Please do, but I want Jon-Marc to give us
I mean, I
his.
want Jon-Marc to say something because it's such.
Yeah.
I mean, CB and I, you're just preaching to the choir here. We love your play. It's why I raised money to stage it here in Houston after my election was over. But it's just like I said about the churches. We don't need to show relatively conscious to Black people. We need to take relatively conscious into every white neighborhood and white church and white theater. And it's something that everybody needs to see, because you touch on I still get so emotional about the fact that the universe brought you and I together during this campaign. Because I think I was brought to you not only to just adore you, but to find a way to bring relatively conscious to a larger, diverse audience. So talk about your show, talk about racism, talk about Southeast Texas.
Well, it was fascinating. I think one thing that's interesting about what CB said and about what you said, Dana, is that, I grew up as a child of the 80s and the 90s. And so when I went to work on this campaign in 1998 and was closeted and working for a virulently right-wing candidate, I grew up primarily in a white world and thought racism was a thing of the past. And then, not 10 miles down the road, one night, this man is literally dragged behind a truck and his body splits in two for no other reason than the color of his skin. And it was a point of reconciliation for me. Like, how do I merge my worldview with reality? Because the reality was, it wasn't a thing of the past. But in my mind, how could this happen? And this was 1998. How could this happen in 1998? And the fact is that even though James Byrd got a lot of headlines and the media descended on East Texas at that point,
we're all going to chip in and get Jon-Marc better Wi-Fi.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Let me see if I can change it over.
While you're doing that, I would like to point out, when we talk about what the events that happened with James Byrd, and it's unfortunate and fortunate that I became very good friends with his family during the campaign, because Jasper was in the district I was running for, and I almost didn't feel worthy going to family picnics and things around James's grave, just because it's so horrific. But when we talk about what happened to James Byrd Jr., and when we talk about the media descending on Jasper, and we talk about what happened after, it was over 20 years ago, and aren't we saying the same exact stories right now with the young Black men that are being murdered for the color of their skin, for what happened to George Floyd? How is it any different? Isn't it the same thing still happening?
It's not any different. It's just being called. It's different. It's been giving different names. The headlines are still the same. It's not much different than Emmett Till. It's not much different than, growing up in Virginia, it was illegal for a Black and a white person to be married when I was born. My aunt was married to a white man, and she could not come visit my mother in the hospital because she would be put in jail because her husband was white. So they had to wait till I was old enough to take me to Philadelphia so the family could see me. My great-grandfather was the product of a Jewish shop owner and his Black saleswoman. The baby came out light-skinned, blonde with green eyes. She couldn't take that baby home, and he wasn't going to take it home. So my grandfather was raised by the midwife.
Wow.
This was the reality of our world living in Virginia.
But it just hasn't changed that much.
It hasn't changed much.
And I love that UCB brought up statues, because, I've been raised in Houston, Texas my entire life, and, going past the statues of Sam Houston, and, and to me, it was like, oh, it's Texas heritage. I'm so proud. And then And I constantly think about that now. How did my Black friends feel going past all of these, or some of our schools, Robert E. Lee High School, go Lee, oh my God,
Mhm.
why did I not ever know? And why are those names still there? And how do you make somebody understand what it makes your Black friends feel like that, that we still have these statues in Herman Park. We still have the schools named Robert E. Lee. I know, again, preaching to the choir, lost
Yeah,
in words.
it is hard, as Jon-Marc was saying, I'm sort of dedicated myself to how do I get people to understand without sounding like I'm angry or that I'm preaching at them, or so for me the arts are the best way to do that. But then in the arts it's very difficult to get things produced from the perspective of the other. The things that we see mostly in the arts are people of privilege talking about others, but it's very hard to have the other's perspective seen as the predominant perspective of how it feels. Um, it's and finding that voice that will make people empathize with what it is that you feel like when you see that. When I see a Confederate flag, or I see one of those statues, or I walk into one of those buildings and it's named after this person. How do or a friend of mine sent me a play to read, and there was all this antebellum, wonderful Confederate beauty about the time, and she wrote in it how these slaves were like family. I said, baby, who were them slaves? We were never family.
Well, it's almost like Jon-Marc is the bridge between, CB's the angry Black man, and I'm the, ignorant white privilege, trying to do good in the world. And maybe that's what you do, Jon-Marc, is there has to be a way to bridge this. I mean, there were organizations in Houston that were mad at me for running, Black organizations that were mad at me for running for Congress. And it's like, I can apologize for being white, but I didn't want to do this, but nobody else stepped up to run for office. So I'm here. Help me figure out how do I get out and campaign? How do I talk to the people on all these different sides? So maybe that's another reason I love Jon-Marc's play so much, is I felt like it really
Yeah.
brought in both worlds.
Um, they
Is
they
my
just
audio
erected
back? Am I
they,
back?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Go
they
ahead.
just erected this new statue in Virginia called the Freedom Emancipation Statue, and I think that the sculptor's name was Thomas J. Warren. It's one of the most beautiful statues I've ever seen, and Thomas J. Warren is a white man, and so it's art has no color, truth has no color. So when you when we decide that we're going to speak that truth out of a place of reconciliation and for better lack of love, it doesn't matter who you are. And that's what I loved about Jon-Marc's play, is that um, he gave voice to so many different people, but he gave them authentic voices, and he gave them and we saw them from three or four different perspectives. We saw the perspective of the Black person coming into the town. We saw the perspective of the woman who owned the restaurant, and the redneck who couldn't take his hands off of her, although they weren't married, and his character who comes in and he's like just totally disheveled because he's just been outed. And I'm like, wow, you're speaking to four different people in their perspective and forcing them to see and hear each other. Some, for a couple of them for the first time, because no one person is all evil and no one person is all right, because there's just as much racism in the Black community as it is in the white community, out of bitterness and anger. It's two wrongs don't make a right. So I guess what I'm saying is finding a way. I think his play finds a way to force us to hear each other, and to see each other.
You know, there was a question, and it's bothered me ever since we staged the show here in Houston, because we did a great Q&A afterwards, and it was a really mixed audience. But there was a young Black woman who wasn't particularly all that familiar with the James Byrd and Jasper story. But what bothered her, and I'm not sure I ever heard an answer, was she confronted you, Jon-Marc. I don't know if you remember this, but she said, how can you possibly compare coming out to being Black? She was really bothered by that. And that surprised me. So, comments, observations from you, CB, on that. It was just kind of like, I
Yes,
love CB.
please, please.
I
Oh my
love
God.
Talk
CB.
about that,
You want to
CB.
talk about that?
Yeah.
I came out at 19. I went back in at 28. Now I don't know where I am. Oh God. Because how can the culture that the church, that this false church narrative has brought into America with all its false puritanical ideals, have brought have forced Black people into this box where they have to be more righteous, more pure, more everything just to fit in. And so it's
Because it never dawned on me
I've heard many Black people
that
angry that they said,
that
well,
was even
gays.
an issue until she brought it up.
Oh yeah, I've heard many Black people jump on the fact that these gays jumped on civil rights and they're doing more for them than they are for us, and we were fighting for civil rights before they came out. I've heard that argument 100 times.
And see, I had never heard it, and it just totally floored me. Just like towards the end of my campaign, I was invited to a homecoming in Southeast Texas on a Sunday, and everybody was preaching, and I was loving it, and it was great. And then all of a sudden, the preacher went into the whole, the fact that homosexuality was the same as adultery. And I thought my body man was going to sit on me. I mean, everybody sitting in the pew, tensed up. What is she going to do? And I finally just leaned over and said, I have to leave. And I got up and walked out and went outside and just shook. I wish I had stood up right then and there. And again, like the 6-year-old said, excuse me, my hand is up. But I did speak to the minister afterwards. And when he asked me, how did you like the sermon? I said, oh, you and I need to talk.
Well, most of the ministers I know that will sit up and make those sort of messages, those hate-filled messages, also have scores of gay people working for them on purpose, writing their music, running their office, and some of them sleeping with them on the side. It's just the hypocrisy just never ends. And
yeah, just amazing.
Jon-Marc, can you, what has been your journey up? We know the incredible power of the people that you've written about, but where did this come from? What kind of world did you navigate? Can you share and kind of reintroduce yourself?
Yeah, so I apologize. I'm at a hotel lobby. There's work being done at the apartment, and I can't. So there's a lot of background noise, but hopefully I can get through here. When James Byrd was murdered during the campaign, it was just a few miles away from where I was managing this campaign, and it caused me to have to reconcile a lot of things that I thought I knew about the world with what was actually happening in the world. And thousands of people before James Byrd have been murdered. Hundreds since James Byrd have been murdered. James Byrd somehow got headlines, rightly so, but this has been happening throughout our history. Violence especially against the other. This country, we like to think that we've been taught, many of us have been taught, that this country was built on these great and wonderful ideals. And that part is true. We have espoused these ideals. The part that isn't true is we never lived up to them, you know? And we are a people who love to talk about freedom, but we rarely want to offer it to everyone. And so this country, you know, what Tony P does in the play is his thing is, well, this is a good country that has problems. And then Jimmy Arthur is coming in from the other perspective. This is not, this is a country that has problems that can be good, you know, but we've got to come to terms with this first. I think where I got the title, The Relatively Conscious, Baldwin says it 3 times. We know of. He says this phrase 3 times, and each time he says it, it's in different contexts. One time he says it, it's in a radio interview in 1961, and he says it, the relatively conscious Black person in this country, to be relatively conscious and Black in this country is to be in a rage almost all the time. And he goes on, that's the most famous of his relatively conscious. That's the most that gets quoted. But another time he says it, and I don't want to get it wrong, is in his essay, From the Fire Next Time. It's the second essay in The Fire Next Time. It's called Letter from a Region of My Mind. And he says, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in song by slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. I think what we're seeing right now in our world is the fire next time. We did not come to terms with what Baldwin hoped that we would. And we are now suffering the consequences of it. Because, you know, someone said earlier, you know, that CB said, you know, people thought that this was just a thing that happened in the past. Well, Dana and I know, and CB certainly knows, but if we can go to East Texas and get in the company of people who look like me, and don't tell them what you're from or what you're about, and I guarantee you're going to hear the N-word dropped relatively quickly. I mean,
and often.
It's not, this isn't like a thing of the past. And it's not a thing in the same radio interview where Baldwin mentions relatively conscious and rage. Langston Hughes also is in that interview. And it's interesting because Langston Hughes and Baldwin just didn't get along. And you can kind of tell in this interview. But he says, this isn't, I travel all over the country reading my poetry. This isn't exclusive to the South. And that's absolutely right. You know, CB said, you know, in New York, it just takes on a different tone. It takes on a different color. It's a little more subtle, but it's there. Baldwin talked about it. You know, Baldwin talked about, you know, there'll be this smile to your face, but you know, get them behind closed doors, and everybody's got their feelings. All you have to do is make someone comfortable enough, and you'll see where they're coming from. You know. We're all on guard when we're out in public. I think one of the perfect metaphors for where we are today is that we have 2 things going on. We're all masked up because of this vaccine. And we're all wearing our physical mask. But the reality is we've been wearing these masks for so long. We all wear masks when we walk out in the public. And many of us wear masks love and tolerance and kumbaya. And in reality, we take those masks off when we get home. And what we do behind closed doors and what we say to others that we think are like-minded, that's where the test of character comes into play.
No.
Yeah.
That's
But oh,
it.
honey, I have no filter. So
Right.